Neoliberalism and the fear of the criminal alien. The Clinton era would prove to be the most consequential for the growth of mass immigrant detention. The 1990s are often remembered for the culture wars, in which polarization deepened over certain social and political issues, such as religion, sexuality, and abortion. Despite these divisions, Democrats and Republicans aligned in a number of areas, including crime, immigration, and the economy. Neoliberal policies that favored the so-called free market approach and small government, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the rollback of welfare, furthered economic disparities in both the United States and Mexico, increasing tensions around immigration. Terrorist attacks during Clinton's first term instigated fears around national security and the need to defend ourselves against the quote-unquote criminal alien. In response, Congress greatly expanded the legal framework for mandatory detention and deportation. And perhaps most memorable in the history of mass incarceration, the passage of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 led to a considerable expansion of law enforcement and a surge in the prison boom. These heightened conditions, neoliberalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, tough-on-crime rhetoric, and national security initiatives created the perfect storm for building up the prison industrial complex and deportation machine to levels never seen before. Barely a month after Clinton's inauguration in 1993, a bomb exploded at the World Trade Center, killing 6 people and injuring another 1,000. One of the men who planned the attack, Ramzi Youssef, had claimed asylum when arriving in the United States in 1992. After initially being detained at an overcrowded INS jail, he was released on parole while awaiting a hearing on his case. That Youssef had been let go by the INS incensed Clinton and other politicians. Several months after the bombing, the Golden Venture, a cargo ship carrying nearly 300 Chinese immigrants, docked offshore in Queens, New York. Chinese arrivals had skyrocketed in the 1990s to nearly 100,000 per year. News media heavily covered the arrival of the Golden Venture, raising questions about how INS would respond. Clinton homed in on the smuggling networks that brought the Golden Venture to shore and issued a directive to, quote, preempt, interdict, and deter alien smuggling, end quote. The memo also specified that migrants who enter with assistance from, quote-unquote, criminal syndicates, end quote, shall be detained as a deterrent to smuggling, quote, to ensure repatriation if asylum status is denied, end quote. Even though both incidents took place in New York, Clinton emphasized the idea that securing the southern border would be critical to stopping these types of events from taking place. Quote, the simple fact is that we must not and cannot surrender our borders to those who wish to exploit our history of compassion and justice. We must say no to illegal immigration, end quote. INS decided to send 154 Chinese migrants who had arrived on the Golden Venture to York County Prison in Pennsylvania. York County opened its prison in 1979 with the capacity to hold 200 people, but after the incarceration rate skyrocketed, the population in the prison reached almost 600 people a decade later. Anticipating federal use, the county expanded to an even greater capacity of 1,200. After INS began using the jail, York County officials noted that its, quote, capability to house federal prisoners and INS detainees has been so successful that the county decided to further expand the prison facility, end quote. York continued its expansion spree in the late 1990s, becoming the largest INS detention center in the United States at the time. Many of the immigrants who arrived aboard the Golden Venture spent years locked up at the York County Prison until Republican Representative Bill Goldling pressured Clinton to release the 53 remaining immigrants in 1997, citing the hypocrisy of raising concerns over human rights in China while detaining Chinese asylum seekers. The market-based political ideology of neoliberalism, which encouraged reduced government spending, had been heavily promoted by Reagan, but advanced considerably in the 1990s under Clinton. Despite opposition from labor unions, Clinton ratified NAFTA during his first year in office. NAFTA was touted as a tool to help curb, quote, illegal immigration, end quote. Yet, the agreement instead spurred a major rise in Mexican immigration to the United States. In NAFTA's first decade, quote, 1.1 million small farmers and 1.4 million other Mexicans dependent upon the farm sector were driven out of work, end quote. The number of Mexican migrants arriving in the United States each year more than doubled by the end of Clinton's time in office, reaching 770,000 in 2000. While the media and politicians instilled panic over the quote-unquote border crisis, as activist and writer Harsha Walia reminds us, the cumulative impacts of NAFTA led to a crisis of displacement. Economic restructuring and growing income inequality left many rural communities financially strained. As manufacturing was offshored and agribusiness made small farms obsolete, struggling rural towns viewed prison and jail expansion as a source of economic development. Anti-prison advocate Tracy Hewling notes the degree to which prison building became the economy of choice for these communities. Quote, between 1990 and 1999, 245 prisons were built in rural and small town communities, with the prison opening somewhere in rural America every 15 days, end quote. Neoliberal focus on individualism and human competition only served to increase the number of people considered disposable. As social inequality grew, waning support for public benefits left poor and working class communities reeling. These changing conditions were showcased in California in the 1990s. Many Californians became unemployed after the end of the Cold War and subsequent downsizing of the defense industry. The beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles police resulted in both uprisings by communities of color and more police on the streets. With the downturn in the economy and racial tensions at the forefront, immigrants became an easy scapegoat for the nativist right, as well as for Democrats. In an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein singled out immigrants with criminal convictions when she wrote that, quote, rather than having our taxpayers underwrite the prison cost, end quote, the government should return them, quote, to their home countries for imprisonment, end quote. Rest in peace. In 1994, California passed two ballot initiatives that would advance both the war on crime and the anti-immigrant policy. Proposition 184, or the 3 strikes and you're out law, imposed longer sentences on people with repeat offenses, expanding the California prison population. California voters also approved Proposition 187, which would have denied health care to undocumented immigrants and prevented schools from letting them enroll. The initiative also focused on the notion that immigrants commit crimes. Quote, the people of California have suffered and are suffering personal injury and damage caused by the criminal conduct of illegal aliens in the state, end quote. The proposition passed in a landslide, but was challenged in the courts and days after it passed was prevented from being fully implemented. Clinton came out in opposition to Proposition 187 by proclaiming, quote, if you turn the teachers and other educators into instruments of a sort of a state police force, it's like bringing Big Brother into the schools, end quote. However, he would eventually agree to cutting other benefits. 2 years later, he went on to sign the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, more commonly known as welfare reform. It drastically curtailed public benefits for poor and working class people, in addition to denying immigrants and anyone with a felony drug conviction access to welfare and certain federal medical benefits. Providing welfare became a proxy for aiding the quote-unquote racially undeserving, and the campaign against it relied on divisive anti-Black and anti-immigrant discourse. Clinton was a true believer in the neoliberal hocus-pocus of competition and every man for himself, which drove not only his economic policy, but also his approach to crime and immigration. The same year that California voters approved Propositions 184 and 187, Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, otherwise known as the Crime Bill, which some consider, quote, the most extensive federal crime legislation ever passed, end quote. Future President Joe Biden continued his tough on crime agenda and championed the bill in the Senate. Rest in peace. The new law funded 100,000 more police officers, expanded the federal death penalty to an additional 60 criminal offenses, and increased funding for prisons. The funding was partially earmarked for states that enacted, quote, truth in sentencing, end quote, laws, which prevented people from being granted parole. As with previous drug and crime-related legislation, the crime bill resulted in a ballooning of the prison system and included immigration provisions. Much of the framing around immigration restrictions focused on the quote-unquote criminal alien, which became common vernacular that was often interchangeable with quote-unquote illegal alien. Again, the provisions on immigration focused on boosted funding, expedited deportations, and greater coordination between federal and local law enforcement. These reforms to immigration policy in the crime bill further entrenched the fusion of the criminal legal system and the immigration enforcement system. Then came 1996. For immigrant justice activists, the effects of the year 1996 linger like a perpetual dark cloud. Following a decade of laws that expanded the grounds for detention and deportation via the criminal legal system, the 1996 laws supersized the immigration enforcement system. Both the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IIRA, were passed that year. Together, they changed the paradigm on immigration to one that emphasized citizenship rather than residency and laid the legal foundation for the expansion of the deportation machine that emerged following 9/11. New York University law professor Nancy Morowitz describes the severity of the 1996 immigration laws. Quote, overnight, people who had formed their lives here, came here legally or had adjusted to legal status, were working here, building their families, suddenly, because of some conviction, weren't even allowed to go in front of a judge anymore. They were just fast-tracked to deportation, end quote. After the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh, a white U.S. military veteran, Clinton and Congress went into high gear to pass legislation to quell the country's fears about domestic terrorism. AEDPA has turned out to be one of the most harmful pieces of legislation passed in recent history. Its most notorious provision limits the use of habeas corpus, or the ability to appeal wrongful imprisonment. It also requires the Supreme Court to defer to state rulings, preventing the federal government from intervening where there are constitutional errors, even in capital punishment cases. On immigration, AEDPA greatly expanded the scope of what is considered an aggravated felony to a whole host of crimes, including misdemeanors with sentences as little as 1 year, down from the previous 5-year threshold. Many crimes that were not technically felonies and would not be considered aggravated in the criminal context became aggravated felonies including, quote, bribery, counterfeiting or mutilating a passport, obstruction of justice, gambling offenses, and transportation for the purposes of sex work, end quote. Upon signing AEDPA, Clinton said that it stood, quote, as a tribute to the victims of terrorism and to the men and women in law enforcement who dedicated their lives to protecting all of us from the scourge of terrorist activity, end quote, ACAB. The singling out of law enforcement as being uniquely endangered by doing their jobs to protect citizens reinforced the idea that ensuring police safety is more essential than protecting civil liberties. While AEDPA was another instance of bipartisan efforts in Congress to incorporate anti-immigrant provisions into crime-related legislation, IIRA was a concerted Republican strategy to create an even harsher immigration system. Prior to its passage, legal permanent residents, or green card holders, were still able to make their case against being detained if they were convicted of an aggravated felony. But now they were required to be locked up while they went through immigration proceedings. The law applied retroactively, meaning that if you had committed a crime in the past and served your time, you could still be detained and deported. As the law expanded the scope of who could be targeted and imprisoned, it effectively manufactured a growing number of quote-unquote criminal aliens. IIRA also took collaboration between law enforcement and INS one step further by creating the 287G program, which gave local police the authority to enforce immigration laws. IIRA made it much more difficult for immigrants to obtain legal status, ensuring that the undocumented immigrant population would grow. Rather than allowing immigrants to apply to adjust their status while in the U.S., IIRA introduced 3- and 10-year bars, as they are commonly called. It required immigrants to, quote, leave the United States to apply for their green card abroad, but as soon as they depart, they are immediately barred from re-entering the country for a period of time, end quote. 3 years for those who had been in this country without status for 6 months, 10 years for those who had been in the country for over a year without status. The provisions resulted in many migrants being trapped in the U.S., living without status out of fear that they would not be able to come back if they were to leave. Combined, the 1996 laws normalized mandatory detention as a legitimate way to treat non-citizens. INS began pushing for more detention to manage deportations. In 1996, Doris Meissner, INS commissioner, explained to Congress, quote, we do very well on deporting those people who are in detention. It is very difficult and labor intensive to deport people who have orders of deportation who are not in detention. It's crucial. That's why we ask for it, end quote. Meissner's quote shows how detention served to facilitate deportation. As capacity grew, so did deportations. INS continued its expansion plan and, in 1998, opened the Batavia Detention Center near Buffalo, New York, far from the southern border, but where prisons were omnipresent. After the 1996 laws, the average daily population in detention more than doubled from 7,475 in 1995 to 15,447 in 1998. In response to these shifts, in 1997, Detention Watch Network was founded by a group of legal service providers who afforded counsel to immigrants and who felt the immediate impact of the laws on their clients. Attempts were made by advocates to, quote-unquote, fix 96 in the late 90s by rolling back some of the harsh provisions. And in President George W. Bush's first year in office, A growing effort toward another amnesty was also gaining steam. However, the events of September 11, 2001 stalled the reform attempt.